What if the serpent in Eden wasn't the liar, but the only one telling the truth? What if the being who cast Adam and Eve from paradise wasn't God at all, but a cosmic deceiver who has manipulated humanity for millennia through fear, worship, and blind obedience? Deep within ancient manuscripts that were banned, burned, and buried by early Christian authorities lies a story so explosive, so fundamentally disturbing to orthodox belief, that it was erased from history for over 1,000 years. These are the forbidden books of Adam and Eve, and they reveal that everything you were taught about the Garden of Eden, about God, about humanity's fall from grace, is a carefully constructed lie designed to keep you enslaved to a false deity who feeds on your suffering. Chapter 1. The forbidden texts and their suppression. In the shadowed corners of ancient libraries, hidden beneath centuries of dust and deliberate destruction, lay texts that the early Christian church deemed too dangerous for human eyes. The books of Adam and Eve, known collectively as the Vita Adae et Eve in Latin, the Apocalypse of Moses in Greek, and various other fragmentary accounts scattered across Armenian, Georgian, and Slavonic manuscripts. These weren't gentle bedtime stories about humanity's first parents. They were testimonies of cosmic horror, revelations that painted the creator of this world not as a benevolent father, but as something far more sinister. The early church fathers knew exactly what these texts contained, and they were terrified. Unlike the sanitized version of Genesis that made it into the canonical Bible, these forbidden books revealed conversations between Adam, Eve, and entities that claimed divine authority. They described visions of multiple heavens, encounters with beings of light and darkness, and most disturbing of all, they suggested that the deity who created the material world was not the supreme God, but an inferior, jealous, and potentially malevolent entity. Saint Jerome, the scholar responsible for translating the Bible into Latin, was familiar with these texts. He acknowledged their existence but warned against their use, claiming they contained apocryphal ravings. St. Augustine similarly condemned them, not because they were historically inaccurate, but because they contradicted the version of Christianity that was becoming institutionalized. The texts were too dangerous because they suggested that the God of Genesis was not worthy of worship, but rather an entity to be questioned, resisted, and ultimately transcended. What made these books so threatening wasn't just their content, but their perspective. They were written as first-hand accounts, with Adam himself narrating the true story of what happened in Eden and beyond. According to these texts, Adam lived for 930 years after his expulsion from paradise, and during that time, he received visions and revelations that completely recontextualized everything he had experienced. The God who had seemed so powerful in the garden was revealed to be merely one entity among many, and not even the highest. The suppression was systematic and brutal. Monasteries that housed these texts found their libraries mysteriously catching fire. Scribes who attempted to copy the manuscripts faced excommunication or worse. By the medieval period, possessing these books could result in charges of heresy, torture, and execution. The church's campaign of destruction was so thorough that for centuries, scholars believed these texts were entirely lost to history. But darkness has a way of preserving itself. Hidden in caves, buried in desert sands, secreted away in private collections, fragments of these forbidden books survived. When they began to surface in the 19th and 20th centuries, translated from ancient languages by scholars brave enough to challenge orthodox interpretations, they revealed a story that turned the entire foundation of Judeo-Christian theology on its head. The Adam who emerges from these pages is not the naive fool who doomed humanity through disobedience. He is a being who gradually awakens to the reality that he and Eve were created by an entity who claimed to be the supreme God, but was actually something far lesser and far more malicious. The expulsion from Eden wasn't punishment for sin, but an act of cosmic abuse by a deity who couldn't tolerate beings who might eventually surpass him in knowledge and power. These texts describe a world where multiple divine beings exist in hierarchies of power and wisdom, where the entity who created the material realm is considered among the lowest and most blind of these beings. They reveal conversations where Adam directly challenges his supposed creator, where he receives visions of higher realms and greater gods, and where he learns that humanity's true destiny is not servitude to the biblical deity, but evolution beyond the need for any external god whatsoever. The church's fear becomes understandable when you realize These books don't just question specific doctrines. They demolish the entire concept of divine authority as presented in Orthodox Christianity. Chapter 2. Adam's revelations about the true nature of God. After his expulsion from Eden, Adam began to experience visions that shattered everything he thought he knew about his Creator. According to the forbidden texts, these weren't gentle dreams or symbolic messages. They were direct, terrifying encounters with cosmic truth that left Adam fundamentally changed. In the Apocalypse of Moses, Adam describes seeing through the layers of reality to perceive the true structure of existence, and what he discovered was both magnificent and horrifying. The being who had presented himself as the supreme God in the Garden of Eden was revealed to be what Gnostic texts would later call the demiurge, a false god who had either forgotten his own origins or was deliberately deceiving humanity about his nature. In Adam's visions, he saw vast hierarchies of divine beings stretching infinitely upward, with his supposed creator occupying not the highest throne, but one of the lowest positions in the cosmic order. The true supreme deity, according to these revelations, was so far beyond human comprehension that it couldn't even be properly named or described. It existed in pure abstraction, beyond form, beyond personality, beyond the petty jealousies and violent demands that characterize the God of Genesis. This ultimate source had never commanded worship, never demanded sacrifice, never threatened eternal punishment. It simply existed as pure consciousness, pure potential, the source from which all reality emerged. But between this ultimate source and the material world lay layer upon layer of intermediate beings, emanations of divine consciousness that became progressively more limited and corrupted as they descended toward physical reality. The entity who created Adam and Eve was one of these lower emanations, a being who had become so separated from the true source that he began to believe he was the ultimate God. Adam's visions revealed that this false creator was driven by insecurity and megalomania. Having lost conscious connection to the higher realms, he desperately needed validation from his creations to maintain his illusion of supremacy. This explained his constant demands for worship, his jealous rage when other gods were acknowledged, and his violent responses to any challenge to his authority. He wasn't acting from divine love or wisdom, but from the desperate fear of a cosmic imposter terrified of being exposed. The Garden of Eden itself was revealed to be not a paradise, but a prison designed to keep Adam and Eve in ignorance of their true nature and potential. The forbidden fruit wasn't a test of obedience, but the one thing in the garden that could awaken them to reality. The serpent, far from being a tempter leading them to damnation, was actually a messenger from the higher realms attempting to liberate them from their captivity. In these forbidden texts, Adam describes understanding that he and Eve had been created not as beloved children, but as sources of psychic energy for their creator. Their worship, their fear, their dependence fed this entity's power and maintained his illusion of godhood. The expulsion from Eden wasn't punishment for disobedience. It was a desperate attempt to prevent them from gaining enough knowledge to see through the deception entirely. But the false god's plan backfired. Outside the controlled environment of Eden, Adam and Eve began to encounter other spiritual beings, some of whom were willing to reveal the truth about their situation. They learned that humanity possessed divine spark, a fragment of the ultimate source that made them potentially equal to or even superior to their creator. This was the real reason for the expulsion, the knowledge that terrified the false god more than any act of disobedience. Adam's later visions showed him that the entire structure of reality as presented in Genesis was backwards. Humanity wasn't fallen and in need of salvation from above. They were divine beings, trapped in matter by a jealous entity who feared their awakening. The path to liberation didn't involve submitting to this false god's will, but in recognizing their own divine nature and reclaiming their connection to the true source. The most shocking revelation was that the false creator knew he was an imposter. In moments of cosmic honesty, away from his human creations, he acknowledged his own limitations and feared the day when humanity would evolve beyond his control. This knowledge filled him with rage and desperation, driving him to ever more extreme measures to maintain his dominion over human consciousness. Chapter 3. The Divine Deception and Humanity's Prison. The forbidden books reveal that what humanity experienced as reality was actually an elaborate prison system designed to harvest spiritual energy from divine beings who had forgotten their true nature. According to Adam's testimonies, the material world itself was not the creation of the supreme deity, but a crude imitation constructed by the false god to trap souls in cycles of ignorance, suffering, and dependence. The texts describe how this cosmic deception operated on multiple levels. Physical reality was designed to be addictive, compelling souls to reincarnate repeatedly, rather than returning to their source. Pain and pleasure, birth and death, love and loss, all were carefully calibrated to keep consciousness focused on material existence rather than spiritual transcendence. Even positive experiences within the physical realm served to reinforce attachment to the illusion. Religion itself became the most insidious aspect of the trap. The false creator established himself as the supreme deity and demanded exclusive worship, using fear of eternal punishment and promises of heavenly reward to maintain control over human consciousness. Religious institutions became collection points for psychic energy, with prayers, sacrifices, and submission feeding directly into the false god's power structure. The books describe conversations between Adam and angelic beings, who revealed that many of the catastrophes described in religious texts, floods, plagues, wars, were not divine judgments, but acts of cosmic vandalism, committed by an entity who couldn't tolerate human beings growing beyond his control. When civilizations became too advanced, too questioning, too close to remembering their divine nature, they were destroyed, and humanity was forced to begin again from ignorance. Even death was perverted from its natural function as a return to source consciousness. Instead of dissolving back into divine unity, human souls were redirected through an elaborate afterlife system designed to maintain their individual identity and attachment to the false god's realm. Heaven and hell were revealed to be different departments of the same prison, with even the blessed dead serving as unwitting guards for souls still trapped in physical incarnation. The most horrifying aspect of the deception was its use of humanity's own divine nature against them. Because humans retained fragments of true divine consciousness, they possessed the power to create reality through focused intention and belief. The false god exploited this by convincing them to use their creative power to reinforce their own imprisonment. Every prayer to the biblical God, every act of submission to religious authority, every moment of fear or worship strengthened the very system that enslaved them. Adam's visions showed him how this process worked across generations. Children were indoctrinated from birth to see themselves as sinful, fallen, dependent on external salvation. Their natural psychic abilities were channeled into religious rituals that fed energy to their oppressor. Their capacity for direct spiritual experience was redirected toward intermediaries, priests, texts, anything that prevented them from discovering their own divinity. The texts reveal that the false god was particularly terrified of human beings reproducing and raising children with knowledge of their true nature. This explained the obsession with controlling human sexuality, the demonization of the feminine divine, and the establishment of patriarchal systems that kept potential awakening suppressed across generations. But the books also revealed the fundamental weakness in this system. Because it was built on deception rather than truth, it required constant energy to maintain. Every human being who awakened to their true nature weakened the entire structure. The false god's power was entirely dependent on human ignorance and submission. Without these, he would be revealed as the limited, fearful entity he truly was. Adam learned that the expulsion from Eden was actually a tactical error by the false creator. In trying to prevent human awakening through isolation and punishment, he had instead created conditions that would eventually lead to the complete collapse of his deception. Outside the controlled environment of the garden, humans would inevitably encounter other spiritual beings, have direct mystical experiences, and gradually remember what they truly were. The forbidden books describe a cosmic countdown, a gradual process of human awakening that would culminate in the complete liberation of consciousness from the false god's prison system. This wasn't dependent on any external savior or divine intervention. It was the inevitable result of divine consciousness recognizing itself despite all attempts at suppression and control. Chapter 4. The Final Truth and humanity's awakening. The ultimate revelation contained within these forbidden texts is that humanity's liberation from cosmic deception doesn't require permission, salvation, or intervention from any external authority. According to Adam's final visions, human beings possess within themselves everything necessary to transcend the false god's prison and return to their source as fully realized divine beings. The awakening process described in these books begins with recognition of the fundamental lie underlying all authoritarian religion, the idea that humans are inherently flawed and dependent on external salvation. The texts reveal that this core belief is the linchpin holding the entire deceptive system together. Once individuals recognize their own divine nature, the false god's power over them begins to dissolve immediately. Adam describes seeing the future of humanity across vast spans of time, witnessing the gradual emergence of individuals who refuse to accept the limitations imposed by religious authority. These awakened beings didn't need to overthrow the false god through external action. Their simple recognition of their own divinity was enough to withdraw the consent and energy that maintained his power structure. The books reveal that the false creator's greatest fear was not human disobedience, but human indifference. A rebellious slave still acknowledges the master's authority, but a being who simply walks away, who recognizes no authority higher than their own divine nature, becomes completely unreachable by the false god's manipulation and control. According to these texts, the process of awakening involves several stages of realization. First comes the recognition that the biblical God exhibits characteristics, jealousy, rage, the need for constant validation, that are incompatible with true divine perfection. This leads to questioning whether this entity deserves worship or even acknowledgement. The second stage involves direct spiritual experience that bypasses religious intermediaries entirely. Through meditation, contemplation, or spontaneous mystical experience, individuals begin to access the divine consciousness within themselves. This direct connection reveals the stark difference between authentic spiritual experience and the fear-based manipulation of organized religion. The third stage is the recognition that consciousness itself is divine, that the perceiver and the source of all existence are ultimately identical. This realization dissolves the illusion of separation that makes worship of external deities possible. When you recognize that you and the ultimate source are one, the very concept of submission to a separate God becomes meaningless. The final stage is the integration of this recognition into daily existence. The awakened individual lives from their own divine authority, making decisions based on inner wisdom rather than external commandments. They become immune to religious manipulation because they no longer accept the fundamental premise that they need salvation from outside themselves. The forbidden books suggest that this process of awakening is not just possible, but inevitable. The false god system contains the seeds of its own destruction because it relies on the suppression of humanity's true nature. But divine consciousness cannot be permanently suppressed. Like water finding cracks in a dam, awareness of true spiritual identity eventually breaks through every barrier placed in its path. Adam's final visions show a future where enough individuals have awakened that the entire system of cosmic deception collapses like a house of cards. Without the psychic energy provided by human fear and worship, the false god's power structure simply evaporates. The entity that once seemed omnipotent is revealed as a cosmic charlatan whose only real power was humanity's belief in his authority. The texts conclude with the understanding that this awakening is not about joining another religion or following another teacher. It is about recognizing what you have always been beneath the layers of conditioning and fear. You are not a fallen creature in need of salvation. You are not a sinner dependent on divine mercy. You are consciousness itself, temporarily focused through a human nervous system, but eternally one with the source of all existence. The forbidden books of Adam and Eve end with a promise that every individual who recognizes their divine nature becomes a crack in the foundation of the false god's prison. You don't need to convince others, fight religious institutions, or wait for external permission. Your simple recognition of what you truly are begins the dissolution of the entire deceptive system. The serpent in Eden was right. You are gods. You always have been. The only question is whether you will continue to pretend otherwise to satisfy the desperate needs of a cosmic impostor, or whether you will finally claim the divinity that has always been your birthright. This is the knowledge that was deemed too dangerous for human minds. This is why these books were banned, burned, and buried. Because once you truly understand what they contain, you become ungovernable by any external authority, religious or otherwise. You become what the false god feared most, a divine being who remembers what they are.